I wasn't sure what I was going to talk about in this vlog, but in a recent one, I mentioned some books that have been a part of my life, and I actually gave a demonstration on how to consult the I Ching, which was fun. That was a fun one. I've read a lot of books, and I don't mean to be bragging, but I have. I've read a lot of books. I've read some nonfiction. For example, during the Bush-Cheney regime, I called it a regime. I read a lot of books about what was going on because I felt as though the government wasn't telling us the truth about why they invaded and occupied Iraq. I probably read a dozen books about what was going on at the time. And I've read some books about Obama's presidency. I'm looking forward to the books that eventually come out about Donald Trump. I think there are going to be some very informative books when all that information becomes available. Just recently, I read a nonfiction book, Shattered, Inside Hillary Clinton's Doomed Campaign, which was a helpful book. It was to help me to understand what went wrong and the various elements that led to her not being elected as president back November 8th. And I've read some fiction too, a lot of fiction. I actually prefer fiction. It's a lot more fun. I've read nearly all the books of Terry Pratchett, the Discworld books, as well as some other series that he's written. I like books rather than short stories because you get to live in them for quite a while. I take my time reading a book. I don't rush through them. I've read some classics. If you want me to be snooty for a bit, I've read some Charles Dickens. I've read some Thackeray, Thomas Mann. I like books, all right? I do have an all-time favorite book, and I've got it in a couple of formats. I have to open this up here. I have it in an ebook on my little Nook. I'm currently reading chapter 11, and I also have it in paper, A Room with a View. Now, why this book? Why is this so important to me? Well, some books, for me, it has to do with symbolism. Like, I love the book Lord of the Flies. Talk about symbolism. That book is just drenched in symbolism. And every time I read it, and I've read it a number of times, I always get more out of it. I've read this book more than any other book. I read it usually almost once a year or every other year. I've read it at least a dozen times or more. I still continue to read it. I read all of E.M. Forster's books. This book, I feel like the symbolism is accessible to me. Howard's End, for example, which is regarded as the best novel that E.M. Forster wrote. That's more about England and the class structure, the class system in England. Well, I live in the USA. We don't have so much of a defined class system here as they do in England. So I like the book, Howard's End. Very good, but it wasn't as easy to identify with. I read a passage to India, but that was more about a time when India was an English colony and what the attitudes, what the conflicts between the classes were like there. A Room with a View gets into somewhat of the class system and the conflict somewhat between the classes, but to me it was more of a book about symbolism, and I could identify with the symbolism. And I'm going to give you some numbers. I have the book because I have it here. I also have it on my computer, and I can do easily a quick word search and a word count. The word window appears 36 times in the book. Curtains are mentioned 13 times. Being seen mentioned 22 times. Like there's a scene, SCENE. There's a part in one chapter where Charlotte tells Lucy, "Come away from the window. You'll be seen from the outside." And then the word view is used some 60 times in the book. Trying to explain this in a way that makes sense. It's like this was a time period, and this was a time period in England. I should stress it that way, when everything was about looking like you're the right kind of person. It was putting out this image, this facade, really, and hiding behind the facade. And as a result, there were a lot of people that didn't really see. They didn't really understand. And that's really the point behind the book. Lucy and her cousin Charlotte claim in the early part of the book, right in the first chapter, that they have no view, which is important because they don't. They don't have a view. But there is someone who, they're at this kind of it's what we would call here like a bed and breakfast. They call it a pension Bertolini. They're at this kind of sort of like a hotel. It's more like a house that's been converted into a hotel. They're staying there, and someone at the dining room table says, I have a view. I have a view. It's Mr. Emerson. And he's actually the room with the view. This gets into the symbolism of a room with a view. And this is one of the things I love about the book. The funny old man that no one wants to pay any attention to, he's the one with the view. And he says, so does my son, George. And George is getting his view. He's getting there. He understands certainly a lot more than Lucy Honeychurch understands. And she's trying to understand. She knows people understand things that she doesn't. And she's trying. But because she's stuck in that class where they hide behind the facade of respectability, it blocks her from seeing that they don't have a view. She doesn't have a view. It's Mr. Emerson. I call a room with a view, the symbolism, the symbol of a room with a view is that's someone who sees life with eyes of understanding. And if you read the book, I'm sorry, I probably spoilt it for you already. I maybe should have warned you about a spoiler. But if you read the book or even see the movie is halfway decent, actually. You look at the person who really understands and who solves the lover's problems. That's Mr. Emerson. Like any literature, there's the storyline. Lucy and her cousin Charlotte are in Florence, Italy. They're part of their vacation, and they meet the Emersons, and people scoff at the Emersons because they're not in the same class. But she sort of likes the Emersons, but they're the ones who understand. There's some sort of an attraction between Lucy and George, but she doesn't understand it yet, but it's there. And it's kind of it's almost like an Edwardian romance novel without all the sex. It's a cute storyline, but like literature, there's something beneath it all. There's symbolism. And if you get into the book and pay attention to references to being seen, like Lucy says to her mother, well, we've seen our way through that. And her mother says, yes, and we've been seen through, and that's worse. Don't want to be seen, must not be seen. We don't want to reveal ourselves too much. Living behind the facade of respectability, people who will do and people who don't do. Those who are acceptable, those who are not. When the crisis comes and Lucy has to face the fact that she really is in love and whom she's in love with, it's Mr. Emerson. And he takes her through something I've done when working with clients in therapy. He takes her through it through tears. That's very effective in therapy. I've brought people to tears, not intentionally, but we get into the painful stuff, and many of them will start crying. And it helps them to see. And when Mr. Emerson does that with Lucy, E.M. Forster, the author, says the scales fell from her eyes, that finally she got to see, even though it was only momentarily. Later in the book, in the last chapter, she talks about, or he mentions, the author, Forster, writes about her talking about Mr. Emerson. She says that she didn't know how he did it, but it's as if he made her see the whole of everything. all at once. And eventually she lost that ability to see. She lost that view, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is that someone who had a view, Mr. Emerson, solved their dilemma for them, sorted out their muddle for them, and as a result, they got to live happily ever after. There's a real contrast between those who have a view and those who don't. For example, during that crisis moment when Lucy's in tears, Mr. Beebe, he's the parson, he comes in and he sees Lucy and he's like, what's going on? And she's like, oh, I've lied to everyone. And he says, but that's rubbish. And Mr. Emerson says, no, it's not rubbish. That's the part of life that you don't understand. That one line, every time I read it, almost every time I read it, it brings me to tears because I understand it. And I've been through it myself working with clients. It's getting them to that point where they can see it and understand it, and then they sort out their problems. So I continue to read it. I'll probably continue to read it through most of the end of my life. It's my all-time favorite book, A Room with a View, and I just felt as though I wanted to talk about it.